We're here with your Connoisseur of Liquors, the top scholar. He's a top scholar on Emily Dickinson and analysis. He's going to do an analysis of a Emily Dickinson poem. And here's the poem, the Franklin number 1715. A word made flesh is seldom, and tremblingly partook, nor then perhaps reported, but have I not mistook? Each one of us has tasted, with ecstasies of stealth, the very food debated, to our specific strength. A word that breathes distinctly has not the power to die. Cohesive as the spirit, it may expire if he, made flesh and dwelt amongst us, could condescension be, like this consent of language, this loved philology.
Why did you choose this poem?
This poem is in the book, dear.
The only one?
Dear, it's a complicated poem, probably complicated, advanced poem. That's why we have this top expert here.
Yes.
He's an expert. I'm the foremost scholar on this topic.
It's all about him.
He's from Harvard.
Yeah.
Okay.
Top scholar.
His name is yours, your Connoisseur of Liquors. I'm your Connoisseur of Liquors. Like, shall I take thee, the poet said. Shall I take thee, the poet said. He says, shall I take thee, the poet said. This is a poem analogizing the human word embodied in a work of art to the Jonine word, the incarnate Jesus. Neither poem is about Christ. His condescension to become human is merely a metaphor for the consent of language to give words philology to the poet's interior contours of feeling. Dickinson, as we know from a draft which is related to A Word Made Flesh, according to Robert Franklin's note, had pondered John's obscure opening of his gospel in sufficient depth to be repelled by a preacher who broached the topic of incarnation without having any intimation of its import. The import of that paragraph, the Word made flesh, had he the faintest intimation who broached it yesterday. Dickinson had intimidations of the import of how much.
No, you don't have to read. Who's going to do that?
Dear, would you not mess up the show? The show is up to 15 minutes.
If you're going to be reading for 15 minutes, I should go then.
If you're hyper inattentive, you're not meant for Harvard classes.
No, I'm not. Too much for me.
You're not into analysis. We're here to do analysis. Dickinson had intimations of the import of John's phrase beyond what she had heard from a superficial preacher. Now this is in depth, dear. And here we read from John 1 through 1 to 5. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. That was the true light, which lighteth every man that cometh into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made by him. The world knew him not. He came upon his own, and his own received it not. But as many are received him, to them gave him he power to become the sons of God, even to them that believe on his name, that which were born not of flesh, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And the Word was made flesh, and dwelled amongst us. And we beheld his glory, and the glory as of the only begotten Father, full of grace and truth.
Okay. No, dan leg je tip uit zo.
We're not getting the car out now.
No, she's afraid of the water coming. There's
Oh,
no water,
watch out
nothing
for it.
out there.
There's nothing there?
It's nothing.
Afraid.
It's not, the rain is not so bad.
The only begotten Son became flesh and condescended to leave his heavenly realm and take on an embodied presence on earth. I'm going to read the poem again for coherence. A word made flesh is seldom and tremblingly partook, nor then perhaps reported, but have I not mistook, each one of us has tasted, with ecstasies of stealth, the very food debated, to our specific strength. A word that breathes distinctly has not the power to die. Cohesive as the Spirit, it may expire if he, made flesh and dwelled amongst us. Could condescension be like this consent of language, this love philology? It seems to Dickinson that the creation out of nothing of a poem or any other work of art makes the poet's creative force analogous to God's own. But is the poem truly created out of nothing in a process analogous to Genesis' narrative of God creating all things ex nihilo? The poem, after all, does employ a rare pre-existent material, words. But a poem is not merely a collection of juxtaposed words, or what Coleridge would have called an assemblage made by fancy. Something apparently has, from no source, has to have happened to the words for them to coalesce into a single new totality. This coalescence, or as Dickinson called it, cohesiveness, was ascribed by Coleridge to an entity he named the imagination. In Shall I Take Thee? We have seen that in Dickinson's view, sustained work and determined will alone do not suffice for the fusion of words into poetry. The poet, too impatiently seeking the mot juste, must wait until the contour of her mental vision sufficiently comes forward to prompt the right word. In rewriting the earlier poem, Shall I Take Thee, into A Word Made Flesh, Dickinson changes her role. In Shall I Take Thee, she is the would-be creator who has to learn patience. But in A Word Made Flesh, she is no longer the maker but the partaker, a member of the poet's audience. She therefore adds the analogy of communion, used in He Ate and Drank the Precious Words, 1593, to the analogy of the Word Made Flesh. Remembering the revelatory reading moment of being pierced by a poem, she wonders how its author knew it was exactly what she needed in the way of spiritual nourishment. The poet is the creative spirit who prepares for us food precisely debated to our specific strength. That is, sustenance professionally weighed against our capacity to digest it, just as a patient will be prescribed the quantity of medicine suitable to his age and weight, more for an adult, less for a child. So the reader has the eerie feeling of being precisely prescribed for by the poet. The physician or / poet, says Dickinson, debates, estimates exactly what is necessary in each case. It seems miraculous that one should receive, like manna from heaven, the very food that matches one's own specific need and capacity. Dickinson expresses her wonder at the miraculous individual accommodation of word to need by the singling out of each one of us by the intensifying adverb very and by the particularizing adjective specific. Dickinson's own initial experiences of aesthetic transport came from books that she perhaps had to read in stealth. Her father would buy books she desired, then implore her not to read them. We know from Thomas Wentworth Dickinson's letter to his wife, written the day after he met Emily Dickinson for the first time, that the poet had told him that the sensation of reading a poem shook her to the core. If I read a book, it makes my whole body so cold. No fire ever can warm me. I know that is poetry. If I feel physically as if the top of my head were taken off, I know that is poetry. These are the only way I know it. Is there any other way? There is no reason to suspect Dickinson hyperbole. Her glimmering retinue of nerves, sever or service of myself, must have trembled in passionate physical sensation during her early encounters with poetry. When, as a young person, she reads, let us say, Shakespeare, her appetite, despite its intensity of desire, partakes of the banquet of embodied words, seldom and tremblingly, nor does she tend to report to others her discoveries and her responses. There is something in Shakespeare for her every mood, her every intuition. The poet found that she is proffered precisely what she was hungering for at the time of reading. In another decade, the food debated to her specific strength might be found on another page entirely. Dickinson doubts the immortality of the soul, but not the immortality of a word-given life. The strongest assertion of the poem emerges from that first shaken encounter with a word that breathes distinctly. Such a poem word has not the power to die because it hinders scattered phrases have been raised into a linguistic coalescence that issues from and matches the cohesiveness of spirit itself. Such a word, Dickinson says, will expire only if spirit expires. When the conceptual language of inner vision reaches its apogee and then consents to incarnate itself as a breathing poem word, it is alliteratively behaving like Christ, who condescended to dwell amongst us. As Milton writes in the poem of the, quote, Ode of a Morning of Christ's Nativity, Christ laid aside his far-beaming blaze of majesty in heaven, and here with us to be, forsook the courts of everlasting day, and chose for us a darksome house of mortal clay. Condescension from descent is used here by Emily Dickinson in her now rare positive sense, a gracious kindness to those of humbler status. The word has been used of the Incarnation from at least the 17th century. We're reading from Dickinson. Helen Vendler is from Harvard. We have a top analyst. He's your Connoisseur of Liquors, reading and analyzing Emily Dickinson.